Is it cannibalism if a dwarf eats a hobbit? Welcome to my channel. I focus on tabletop role-playing games, video games, and science fiction. This was an interesting one to do a little bit of research on and try and find some things that I wasn't able to find, but I'll mention those in a minute. I looked up what is the definition of cannibalism. So one definition is the practice of eating the flesh of one's own species. That's one definition. There are variations on that one. But that brings the question, what does one's own species mean? And one definition of species is the largest group of organisms in which two individuals can produce fertile offspring, typically by sexual reproduction. So this brings up interesting questions in a fantasy world or even a science fiction world. What are two things of the same species? Now we know that if we're talking Dungeons and Dragons, you can talk that elves and humans can produce half-elves. What isn't clear is, are half-elves able to reproduce? Because they may be like a mule, which is a crossbreed between a donkey and a horse, and that produces a sterile offspring that can't reproduce. So are half-elves a form of a sterile offspring? Now, what about dwarves and humans, or dwarves and hobbits? We don't see descriptions in there that get a little bit unusual about, like, is it a half dwarf, half human? If they're not able to reproduce, then they're not, by one definition, they're not the same species. So then that would not be cannibalism if hobbits and dwarfs cannot reproduce and produce fertile offspring. They're separate species. Now this doesn't make it, this is a whole ethics question about what is it to eat another sentient species. And I was trying to find this and I couldn't find the full references. I believe it was in the Uplift War saga by David Brin, which are some pretty good books. I like the first few. I got tired toward the end. I'm not sure if I read all 6 of them, but I know I read at least 4 of them. But there was the scene at the end where the neo-chimps, which are uplifted chimps, which have been raised to sentience by humans, they're at the end that they're hungry and they see where the spaceship of one of the avian species has died and has crashed, and they're going to go have dinner. They get out their knives and head off to dinner. This brings up an interesting question where you're one sentient species eating another. And I thought there was a story by Larry Niven, but I couldn't find it. It was an interesting story. This guy goes into the bar. It's on a space station. I thought it was End Space or Arthur C. Clarke's Tales from the White Heart, but I couldn't find it in there. But anyway, the guy goes into the bar and is sitting talking with the bartender, and this other alien species comes in, and the guy is just really, you can tell he's really uncomfortable by this other species that comes in there. And the bartender, why don't you like them? And he goes, oh, well, he says, I tell you my story. He says, we were part of the first group that found them, that reached out and met them. And so, oh, really? And he says, yeah. So we landed on their planet, and this is we talked, and they said they were very interested in our biology, and they asked if we would consent to a full medical examination. So they poked and prodded and did everything, all these tests, and took samples and so on. And then at the end, they ask us about these legal contracts. And this is what in the legal contracts, he says, yeah, they were about royalty payments and patents. He says, on what? And he says, basically on our DNA. And they said, well, you really should sign them, because if you don't, we know that people have already pirated some of your DNA. And he says, well, what are they going to do with it? And he says, oh, well, this alien species, they enjoy eating other alien species. So they take the DNA of other alien species and clone it and grow things, which then they make soup and other things out of it. And he says, yeah, so I'm actually a very, very wealthy man. I get all these royalty payments off of people eating me. I can't remember. It's a great story, and I thought it was by Larry Niven, but I couldn't find it. If anybody knows what that story is, I'd like to know the link. I'd like to reread it. Larry Niven wrote some wonderful short stories that have some real dark sense of humor. The other one is Man of Steel, Woman of Kleenex, if you ever want to read a satire about Superman. But that's a whole nother story. But here, what does it mean if you're eating other sentient species? Now, we're not talking about is it right or wrong, because then you run into the interesting question of what happens if you're like in the Donner Party, where the Donner Party is isolated up in the mountains and they can't get out because they're snowed in and there's no food. And those are challenging questions that you don't want to face. I mean, there's the story in, I believe it's in the book of Isaiah, about King Hezekiah. And he says he's walking the walls and he sees the one woman screaming. And he says, what's the matter? And she said, they were starving. And he says the two women each had a child. And they said that we agreed that I would kill my son and we would eat him. And then after we ran out of food, we would kill her son and eat him. And she says, so we killed and ate my son, but now she won't kill her son. That's an interesting story about cannibalism in the Old Testament. And it's sort of makes your skin crawl. That was where Hezekiah tears his robes and he's just going, this is horrible. I believe that's the story. Correct me if I'm wrong. Give me some comments about that one. But cannibalism has been with us for forever. Let's be honest. It goes way back. But the question that we have in a fantasy world, if you're not starving, if you're not in one of those horrible situations, and you decide to eat another sentient species. Now, this gets into a whole host of questions because there are so many sentient species in fantasy worlds. You run into all kinds of things. You know, it says, take a look at a centaur. Centaur is not human, not equine. It's sort of a cross between that. Now, we don't think anything, well, some people don't think anything about eating a steak off of a cow. I enjoy a good steak. The other people, of course, we have there are people who disagree with that idea, but I like a good steak. And I have no problem with eating that. And I've never eaten horse, but it would be an interesting question. I would probably be willing to try it. Now, but centaur is an interesting question. Is that cannibalism? Because now we're getting into the fuzzy areas. Or you run into, was it the kenku, which is an avian species that is now can't fly, and you run into all of these things. What does it mean to consume the flesh of a sentient species? Now, you could argue that that's bad. You could take the entire vegetarian approach and say you shouldn't eat meat at all. Okay, that one's a simple argument. You shouldn't eat meat, but we'll get into. You run into some interesting questions. Then what about some of the plant creatures that are in the world? There are a couple of things based upon plants. If you killed and ate them, would that, because they're not animal Okay, it just gets the fantasy world causes real ethical questions with a lot of people, and this is one of them. I mean, even if you say, "Oh, I'm just a vegetarian," or "I'm just a vegan," what does that mean when you've got sentient mushrooms? It causes interesting questions that like, what do you do? What do you do to survive? Then you have to say, "Oh, I don't eat sentient and sentient creatures at all." And then how do you know whether they're sentient or not? I mean, that's the interesting thing. Tolkien implies that Ents bring sentient over time, make the trees alive around them. So that's an interesting question. If there are fruit trees, yeah, okay, but that's getting far afield. But that's the whole question of eating sentient other things. Is that good or evil? Now, you could argue if you don't know that it's sentient, or that you didn't know that it was sentient when you ate it, then you would do that. There's a story in Animate the Gates that I remember. The movie is, but the book is much more interesting. And the book covers, yes, it covers the battle between the two snipers, but that's only a part of the book. It talks about other things. And there's the guy comes home and they haven't had much to eat. And he sits down and his wife sets this plate with stew in front of him. And he's just tasting it. It's great. He hasn't had anything. This is just awesome. And he's almost afraid. And then they're just finishing up dinner, and the knock on the door, and it says the neighbors are accusing their wife of killing their dog. But it brings up interesting questions. When you're starving and you're hungry, what would you eat? And would you eat sentient food, sentient animals? But if you're not starving, isn't that a strange perversion that you want to go out and eat sentient things? And it's an interesting question. I mean, there is, I can't remember who, might have been Larry Niven, who said, if we ever run into an alien in space, the first thing we'll try to do is expletive deleted it, which would be have sex with it. And the second thing we'll try to do is eat it. That's just the way it's been throughout history. The first thing, let's see if we can have sex with it, and the second thing and Larry Niven coined the term Rishartha. And Rishartha is having sex outside of one's own species. And does that apply to fantasy world where you've got elves and dwarves and hobbits and Kenku and a whole bunch of different sentient and semi-sentient species? And do you have them? Rishartha, the one that always boggles my mind, there were rules for Rishartha that Larry Niven wrote out about, we can only have sex at the if my parents watch, and things like that. Yes, that causes your skin to creep. And then the other one is we can't have sex because you have insufficient body openings. It's, that one's there. That one is just really kind of bizarre. But you have to think about it. Some species have more than one. If you haven't seen Babylon 5, where it talks about the Centauri sex, and I think it's Veer is talking about, yes, we have 8, you see. Yeah. Anyway, you gotta, but you talk about sex and reproduction and what is a species, and they're all interrelated. So this is a complex topic, because in your fantasy world, is interbreeding possible? Does it produce fertile offspring? So here's an interesting thought question. If you say eating outside your species is cannibalism, and we say that elves and humans are separate species, but they can produce a hybrid, which is a half-elf, which is infertile. Is it cannibalism if a human eats a half-elf? Because they're no longer part of the same species. Because it's a hybrid. And there are a whole host of questions that this brings up, and you have to try and figure out what you're going to do. Now, yeah, it's like I've been talking about this Kill It and Grill It series that I've been doing, and I'm going, so you kill something else and do you grill it and eat it? Now we know orcs are able to reproduce with just about everything. That's part of their gift. And they're actually commanded to be prolific. Anything that is, you run into half orc, and it could be half orc and half just about anything else, because they can reproduce with them. So that orcs cause real interesting questions. And if an orc decides to eat what it kills, is that cannibalism? And so you have to make some interesting decisions about that, and what do you want to do in your world. So I'd like to hear your comments. If you can give me references to some of these stories, which one of David Brin's books, and where that story came from, I think was Larry Niven, but I may be wrong. Have you ever had characters in your worlds eat other sentient species, and how did you deal with it? Were there ramifications of it? Now you can look. There are actually medical problems with cannibalism. If you a book by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle, which is called Lucifer's Hammer. I'm not sure how well that holds up today, but it was a fascinating book, and that's where you have the bunch of cannibals that are. It's post-apocalyptic. The Earth gets hit by basically an asteroid, and a lot of people are killed. And a bunch of them turn to cannibalism, and there's a large group that become cannibals. And they're going out there, and at the start it talks about the problem, and then there's a doctor. He was a doctor before the comet, or no, was it comet? Yeah, it was comet, it was comet hit. Sorry, it was a comet hit the Earth, and he starts to get involved with the cannibals, and he becomes one of the cannibals, but he tells them, look, we have to eat only healthy people. If you're going to be a cannibal, you want to eat the people that are healthy. If they've got any sickness or disease, you don't eat them. And it's an interesting, the ethics and the philosophy of cannibalism is talked about in Lucifer's Hammer, which was a great book. I enjoyed it. There's the scene about the surfer. If you've read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's the surfer. It is a wonderful scene, but the book may be a little bit dated because it was written a few years ago, and it was placed in near future. So it maybe have some problems, but it was a great book. I truly enjoyed Lucifer's Hammer. And but it talks about the ethics or the practice of being a cannibal. If you've made that decision, how do you should only eat the healthy people, and it should always be prepared, and it should always be, if you're talking about a society where medicine isn't as prevalent, you should always cook it thoroughly, because then you want to kill all the parasites in it. The reason for cooking does change the flavor and the texture, but it also will kill any parasites that may be in the flesh. So those are things that you have to think about. So that's the practice of cannibalism. So have you had these in your world? Tell me your stories about cannibalism in your world. What do you think? Is it cannibalism for a dwarf to eat a hobbit? Or a halfling, if you want to avoid the Tolkien reference. So thank you for watching my video. I look forward to learning what you think about this video. Let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, press the thumbs up button. You can subscribe by clicking the link in the lower left. If you are interested, there are links to more content.